Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Professor Inês Vitorino. I'm going to be mediating this conversation here today, just reminding you that in order for you to follow the translation, you should click on the globe which shows below and on the right side of your screen, and it has interpretation written. You are all really welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this first meeting of the series Na Rede com LabGRIM 2022. Yes, this is the second year of our series, which has been incredible so far. We have gathered Brazilian researchers and also investigators from the United States and Latin America too, in order to dialogue with us on how to protect and how to promote the digital rights of children and the youth. It is such a pleasure, guys, to receive such special guests, counting on you who are here, watching us once again in this initiative, hearing us, following us, and saying good afternoon in the chat. I hope this will be a very rich moment. It's with great joy that we have these moments and these meetings. For those who still don't know, LabGRIM is a research laboratory which talks about relationship between childhood, youth, and the media. It has this trajectory of more than 20 years with the development of research and also in training researchers in the field of communications. We are a laboratory that we are interdisciplinary. We are connected to the post-graduation program in communications from the Federal University of Ceará, and it's currently under the coordination of Professor Andrea Pinheiro, who's a little late, and it has as objectives our lab to carry on with research, extension, and production of communication materials that are committed to the rights of children and the youth. To have this series taking place like we're continuing today, we're counting on the help of Institute Ubíqua, a social institution, non-profit organization, which has the purpose of sharing solutions by using digital connections to encourage human connections and promoting communication as a right, acting in a way that is egalitarian, inclusive, and respecting diversity. I would like to ask the team to share their social media links of LabGRIM and also Institute Ubíqua in the chat for you to know more about our trajectories and follow our actions. So, yes, please do, Jesse. For this event to take place, we are counting on a full network of institutional support, among which I would like to highlight the support from the Federal University of Ceará through the Pro-Deanship of Extension, the Institute of Culture and Art, the Postgraduation Program in Communications, and the partnership with the Institutional Network for Collective Actions of Universities in Brazil and Latin America, which is called Rio Quarentena, and the Network for Research and Communications, RECRIA. So we're really thankful for all of your support and collaboration. Today, we are going to be talking about the new learning environments, a theme which is extremely relevant nowadays, especially when we consider its impacts in the immediate life and the culture of our children and youngsters. We do know how the pandemic of COVID-19 accelerated in Brazil and around the world several changes in our relationship with technology and digital culture, creating new opportunities for learning, but also several risks. In Brazil, 89% of the children and teenagers between 9 and 17, they use the internet, according to data from CGI.br, corresponding to a number of 24.3 million people. However, we should not forget that 58% of them access the internet only through their phones, which is not a small number, and 4.8 million children and teenagers around the country are still disconnected as users, which impacts their learning conditions, their digital competencies, but also exercising their citizenship. The reality we live in is that ancient barriers, such as social inequality and social exclusion, were not overcome. And now there are new challenges appearing, like the expansion of the platformization for education, tactification of the lives of children and teenagers, quickly disseminating without us having collectively agreed upon a culture of data protection. So it's interesting, very much so, to talk today in this perspective or this attempt to compare scenarios and situations and how this issue of new learning environments have been approached in Brazil and in other countries. What can we do to bring more opportunities as they can be offered by these spaces and at the same time minimizing its risks? To think about this and other issues, we're going to listen today to Professors Elisabeth Sylvan and Priscila Gonzalez, to whom I'm very thankful for your availability. And also, I'm really happy to have you in our laboratory and also having the pleasure to introduce you in a little more detail. Professor Elisabeth Sylvan is an executive director of Berkman Klein Center for the Internet and Society. Her life has been dedicated to the social technical system supporting creativity, shared knowledge, and creation. Look, this is so wonderful. In Berkman Klein Center, she leads several educational and technological initiatives about technology and education, self determination, among others. Liz, as she likes to be called, she has a master's and a PhD on MIT Media Lab. She was the president of the Tech Museum in the Silicon Valley, another tech imperative interactive. She's a director of learning, and she has been in communities for the nonprofit organization for tools for open source code, Manylabs, among others. I will stop because both of them have such a long resume. Professor Priscila Gonzalez, she's the director and founder of the Ubíqua Digital Institute and a researcher of the UNESCO uh, Distance Education Department at the University of Brasilia. She's doing her PhD in languages and technologies at Unicamp, and she has a master's in education in family and ICTs in the Salamanca University in Spain. Priscilla is a member of the Ascota. No, she's going to help us pronounce it. Ascota. I don't know. In social entrepreneurship, and she has acted in the field of education and digital culture since the year 2001. She's a member of the Committee of Experts in the ICT Research and Education Center, and she has authored many publications for educators and educational managers. So, with this introduction, I will pass now the floor to Professor Elisabeth Sylvan so she can deliver her presentation and share with us about her experience and knowledge and all of her knowledge so we can learn a little bit from her here today.
Thank you so much, Inez, and thank you, Priscilla. I'm so looking forward to this conversation and very much appreciate being invited to this really excellent series. I had a chance to watch a few of them previous, and it was very exciting to see. I'm going to, can you see my screen okay? Can you see my slides? Okay, great, great, great. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about novel learning um, spaces and some of the old challenges and some of the new challenges. And before I begin, I just want to say that I welcome your comments and your questions in the chat if you would like to share anything with me. If anything I'm saying isn't coming across clearly, please let me know. You may all know one another, but I do not. So if you want to say whether you're a student at the university or if you're a teacher, I'd be very interested in hearing who's in the room too. So please, if you're comfortable, go ahead and do that. I'd love to know who I'm sharing this space with today. So I'll be talking about four things today. First is the promise of what we really hope to see in technology-enabled learning environments, what the real challenges are, And I'm going to talk a little bit about one challenge in particular that I think is particularly important overall, but really came to the front during the COVID epidemic, and what we might consider doing next. That's what I'm going to talk about today. So let's get started. So the promise of technologically enabled learning spaces. Learning spaces are built on top of existing systems, so educational systems, commercial systems, governmental systems. And so any of those systems are part of a design and impact the environment of learning. You can also have the technology itself as an element of these spaces. And then there are particular issues that came to the front during COVID. So I'll be talking about all three of these areas today. And the first thing that I want to do before I go into that is just say what I mean by technologically enabled learning. And I hope you'll forgive me for having some slightly older photographs. These are different moments of my work over time. So some of the pictures aren't what we expect from photographs today. But all of these things are things that I would consider technologically enabled learning. So the first picture on the top left of the two girls working in front of the computer, that's one of the things we hope for. We hope for joyous, enriching, productive learning environments where students and other kinds of learners work both individually and together. We hope the same thing happens in virtual spaces. So this happens to be an older virtual space, but we know right now VR and AR are very big and are potentially growing areas that we need to be attending to as people who are educators, people who think about how to design educational systems, and people who learn in today's world. I include things that we use to sense our technologies that we use to sense our world, to interact with our world, even if they're not embodied, even if it's not our physical bodies ourselves or screens that we're looking at. I include that in as technologically enabled. And I include building with technology, the last picture of my younger self. Working with some young people to build things not unlike what you see, the sensors that you see on the fish tank before that. So all of these things, I would say, I would include in technologically enabled learning. So, okay. I'm going to talk something about the promise of these environments, and I'll also talk about the challenges too. So, but first, let's start with what we're excited about, what's positive. So, and being learner-centric is, of course, not only something that happens in technologically enabled situations, and we hope that it's not novel either, but sometimes it is. You know, there's a lot of traditional teaching methods that do not center the student. And when we say we're centering the student, what do we mean? We mean that the student has agency, that the student has some control and over what they're learning. They can make some decisions. This doesn't mean that teachers don't play a role, they still do. It means that the educational system is designed around the learner, their cultural environment, their physical environment, their technological environment. In technologically enabled situations, technology can be very helpful. It can help learners make their own choices. It can help them to learn at their own pace. It can allow teachers to see in particular moments more broadly when it's done well. You know, it can change the role of the teacher. So instead of a teacher lecturing like I am right now, maybe the teacher is playing the role of a facilitator, of a coach, of someone who intervenes when students are struggling with their work, whether conceptually or emotionally. It's also an opportunity to think about learner-centric also means that it can be more personalized. So that's a term that we use a lot, personalized or adaptive. And the hope of the promise is that the systems can work for the students, to center the students in their own work. So next, the promise allows for learning everywhere. Now we know just from what Inez just said that that doesn't always happen, that students, technology does not always play this role. But let's, for the moment, put that aside. We'll talk about that later for sure. Say what we hope that happens. So if learning happens everywhere, if it happens on your phone, if it happens with your with sensors, if it happens in your school, if it happens in your after school, in museums, at home, then that means you can build your own learning and really support this learner-centric approach. Ideally, platforms are connected between one another, so it's socially enabled as well as technologically enabled, so that the technology enables the interaction, the cultural context. One would hope that it's opt-in, that it has lower barriers to entry. And with all of these things, context and culture really matters a lot. You know, culture is not always shared, and when you put people into big spaces, you need to think about how you're supporting interaction. Again, there's a role for technology design, and there's a role for teachers in that. The last element of the promise is the sort of big picture to me, the democratization of knowledge and skills. So the idea that that technology opens pathways that didn't exist before for many different kinds of students. That's what we hope to realize when we have these spaces that use technology well. We want them to be able to build knowledge, to form their identity, and to enable them access to both financial and social capital that wasn't available to them before. Okay, so now some very real challenges. So there's challenges with educational systems themselves before we even get to the technology. Not everyone has the same access to education. Educational systems are not always equitable. And this, in a very problematic way, follows existing inequities in other parts of society. Now, I chose this particular picture because, you know, I might be saying, well, this is an example of an inequity. These students may not have what they need, but that may or may not be true. Actually, it really depends on how the tools are being used. So we need to be taking a look at what's really happening, not just at the technology itself, but the whole system that's working, that the technology is working within. Second, we have persistent educational systems and habits that are in many cases designed on an industrial model that's for efficiency, not for individual differences and for individualized learning. So if those systems and habits are hard to break, and we just want to acknowledge that that's the space that we're operating in, even before we introduce technology, because the technology can reinforce those patterns or fight against those patterns. Some of those patterns we don't want to be inefficient per se, but we also want to really enable every young person to be fully realized. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the challenges with technology. So I'm just going to start with the fact that technology can lack both in embodiment. It can be very much these boxes on the screen that we're in right now. It cannot acknowledge our whole selves, our physical selves, our emotional selves. And it's not situated in context. This gets at the physical context, the cultural context I was mentioning earlier. Maybe the biggest issue is that technology is expensive. And that means so many different things. It means not everyone gets to have it. It means that when schools are adopting technology, they can be very risk averse, understandably. making them not want to take the novel approach or the approach that might be different than the system. They can be used to continue the same inequities. It can be hard for educators to know how to adopt it into their existing curriculum. They may not be given the space to do that or the resources. And you know, sometimes technology is not the right thing for a particular lesson or a particular set of ideas, but maybe we're feeling like we have to use it if we have it. Or maybe we're being told we have to use it if we have it. So, you know, applying it well is one of the challenges. All right, so we've all experienced different problems during the pandemic, but there's certainly some shared characteristics. I want to start with something that isn't actually a challenge, but the tremendous creativity and resilience that educators, administrators, families, and students showed at a very, very difficult period of time. And that, and how important that was. And, you know, just want to acknowledge that as it's happened in so many different contexts around the world. That said, many people were forced to kind of rush to change. And that's why I use the term pandemic learning as opposed to online learning or something like that, because no educational designer would have chosen this method to get us to change how we teach or how we learn. And yet here we are. The rush to online did not include everyone, and access, I don't want to go talk about access, which is a really complicated, deep problem, but it's not only the technology, like having an internet and having a device, it's all the ways you can use it. It's all the ways that you understand how to use it. And there's levels and depth of access. It's not just about turning on the internet. So that means that a lot of educators and students were under-resourced or left behind. And again, the sort of magnification of existing inequities. And this all is happening in the context of confusion, social isolation, illness, death, exhaustion. We're all really, really tired. Okay, so that's the sort of big picture. Now I'm going to talk about one issue that I think is important to consider as we think about what this rush to online meant and these broader systems that were set up that enabled this rush online. So I'm going to talk about one particular risk of harm for learners, which is datafication. And to start with, I'm going to define what datafication means. So datafication is the process of turning phenomena into data. And so this happens in all aspects of our lives, right? But for young people, what's important is that this will impact them the longest, and they really have the least amount of control of the situation. And during COVID, the amount of data collected on them was greatly increased. So it matters a lot. It always matters, and it matters a lot in this case. So what kind of data? So there's the state or national data that's collected on people and particularly on students, on their socioeconomic status, on their learning. There's municipal data sometimes, and then there's the data that's mostly separately stored in software, in educational technologies, in apps. And, you know, it's not only the things that you would think about. It's not only the family backgrounds and the grades. It's often health information, truancy data. Did you show up at school? Did you have a problem at school? Sometimes it's connected to prison records in state data. And so you can see how something like this that creates a model of what young people are and who they are and how they change over time, how they're developing, who their family is, could be really used in very helpful ways and very unhelpful ways. That's part of what I want to talk about in my next section. I've done at Berkman Klein, we've been working on a investigation into the experiences that educators, education administrators, and EdTech providers have with data for young people during and after COVID, or whatever phase of COVID we're in now. It's not over, but it's a different moment. So, you know, for this study, we are looking at something called digital self-determination. So it's actually not that different than how I was describing being learner-centric. Rather than situating data as something that's owned and exists in the world, we think about it in terms of the individual and how they can actualize themselves with their data and the forces that enable or disenable that. So again, let's look again at the educational systems. So the systems that we were describing in the first place that are designed for efficiency, those stakeholders want to look at us overall, like how do we educate the populace to get to a certain point? It's not necessarily about people being fully themselves, it's about getting to a level of competency. So is that necessarily aligned with what a family wants for their child, or what a child may not know yet to want for themselves? Maybe not. Maybe get somewhere, but maybe it's not everything we want for that child. For an ed tech provider, what are they incentivized to do? They are incentivized to sell likely more software, to maybe, depending on the context, sell some of their data, to connect their data with other data to make productive use of it. Productive use of it for them, is that about enabling the student to become their best selves? Maybe a little bit, but that's not going to be their bottom line. Let's look at educators and administrators. Administrators in many places, schools in many places, are told they need to adopt technology. They may or may not have the capacity to evaluate for themselves. They may not even have transparency for themselves into what's being collected on their students. On top of that, they have many other issues they're dealing with. They have to think about teaching the basics. They have to think about teaching social and emotional learning. They're dealing with COVID. They're dealing with family complexities. They may be dealing with, you know, health services, food services. Are they going to be thinking about whether this particular software is going to do something way down the line that they don't even know about? I would hope so, but they've got a lot on their plate already. Same with the educators in their classroom. So families and students, they may or may not even be aware of these processes. And they certainly, if they are aware, they may feel, well, the data may help my student. You know, teachers actually, the feedback that we've gotten, a lot of teachers feel that the data really is designed to help them. They believe in data for assessment purposes. At least in the US, that's a strong trend. I don't know, actually, I'd love to hear if that's a trend here in Brazil. But the viewpoints may not be as aligned as we would like. So this is the first piece, a problem of the commons. No one owns the responsibility of caring for the data on behalf of the students. And many don't even consider this to be a problem. So when we were having these conversations with the educators of different types, it was even hard to have them think about student data. If they would, you know, we would say, here, this is what the problem is. And they didn't have even the language to talk about it. So through the process, we had to do a lot of education about what even the issues are. So the problem is invisible. That's a problem. Okay. This is the next piece that I was talking about. All these things that would center the student, center the student's autonomy, their digital self-determination, privacy, security, authority over their own data. There's no incentives. In fact, there's anti-incentives for people to think about it. And the students usually can't speak for themselves. Here I'm talking about something a little bit different. So accumulating data, accumulating is not so hard. Making real meaning about learning, making real meaning about emotions, doing things beyond the basic efficiencies, that's hard. And so to realize the full promise, to realize a learner-centric model where learning happens everywhere, follows children throughout their lives, enables them, centers their authority over data, centers their own authority over their data, is very hard to do. And even those districts that we spoke with that were trying, they're making small incremental progress. So here, what am I talking about here? The inequality, the pandemic has deepened existing inequities, and that's always a problem. People are, I actually didn't talk about this, but people are online more. They're spending a lot more time online, but actually the time that they spend online is not necessarily time that's productive and generative. The promise that I was describing, you know, there's a lot of sort of repeating negative experiences to kind of get an endorphin hit. There's a whole other thing we could talk around about that. But that's caused well-being for young people, for teachers, for everybody to really, really be a problem. I talked a lot about datafication. Okay, all of that said, digital innovation did happen. And I think we need to think about how we take what the positives of that and we don't let the system just revert to its previous self. We really take a moment to think about the opportunity of what can come next. And the first thing, and this may sound trite, but I think we need to slow down and reflect. And I think we need that at all levels. I think a lot of educators are burnt out. A lot of everybody's burnt out. A lot of students are burnt out. And so simply giving ourselves pause, if we can, when we can, not everyone can do that, is a great place to start. And then when we can, reflect on our own classrooms, on our own districts, on our own cities and states and countries, on what we really need to do, what's been working. Is, you know, the problem in the classroom that nobody can log on? Well, that's not something I've addressed at all here, but if that's what's getting people stuck, that's what needs to be addressed. Is the problem that teachers aren't being paid enough, and so there aren't enough of them, and they're not supported well enough? If that's the problem, then we need to be looking at it. And we need to be looking at it not only on a local level, but we need, and not only, you know, the people involved in the educational systems, but it's also the communities and the politicians. We all need to be thinking about this. Again, we need to think again about the promise, where we want to be. We don't want to be technology enabling the same kinds of patterns. We want the technology to be enabling the new patterns, what we want to realize. So upon reflection, what do we need to change to enable that? When well-being is a problem, when we know that people are hurting, when we know we feel panicked that some students are falling behind in ways that are truly tragic, we can feel like the social and emotional learning is not as important. And yet we know we're all humans, and so are children. And so one of the things that we heard a lot from our teachers is that they need to slow down with the kids. They need to be able to be given the authority in their own spaces to treat children where they are and to take them as they are. And it's not only about the teachers serving the students, it's about the teachers getting served themselves to have their, so they can be the best selves at work, so that any professionals who support this around are funded and able to work. We need to prioritize social and emotional learning. We also found that people didn't really know a lot about the datafication issue. People didn't know a lot about misinformation and many other topics that are really critical right now. So we need to prioritize this not only for learners, for students, but also for ourselves, for adults, the adults working with kids, and the adults around the kids, which is all of us. Finally, the data problems, we can't fix the data problems without policy. It's not possible. Um, the entrenched systems that I was describing are not designed to allow us to do things differently. And so we need political change, and it's virtually everywhere in the world. It's particularly bad in my country. It's better in some other places, but I don't think anyone's doing it brilliantly well. There are experts who know more than this than I do. Um, but it's just so clear that that's one of the things we need. Thank you very much.
Liz, we are the ones who are thankful. I mean, there are so many thought provoking things. It's really putting pressure on similarities as well when we compare to our reality and the challenging things that we're going through. So, to bring this scenario from Brazil and other countries, I would like now to invite Priscila so she can add their contribution and reflections to this dialogue. And I was quite impressed with some synergies we found, and we can mention them later. But let me pass the floor to Priscilla so she can also bring her contribution to this reflection. I'm sure it's going to be very rich. Priscilla? Thank you, Ines. I was here appreciating so much what Elizabeth was saying. She is so much in sync to what I'm going to tell you about. First of all, thank you for the invitation by LabGRIM. And I would like to reinforce the invitation that Elizabeth made to say that you on the chat, some of you said you are students. From what I understand, everybody's at the Federal University of Ceará. Is this right? Is there anyone else from outside, from basic education? So just for us to have an idea. It would be nice for you to know a little more. I really liked what Elizabeth said, precisely because, let me share, this theme is about promises. So I'm going to tell you about promises involving context. Okay, now everybody is putting them. Yes, people from the Secretariat of Education in Manaus. That's so nice. Very good. When you're talking about identification, I had an online event yesterday, the Internet Forum of Brazil, taking place in Rio Grande do Norte, in Natal. The table I coordinated was about critical data literacy for education. So I'm going to be telling you about this, but my idea is to bring a little bit of the scenario that Elizabeth herself has already advanced the information. So can you see my screen? Can you hear me? Can you see me? I can't see anyone. Okay, perfect. We can hear you very well. That's great. We can see your PowerPoints as well. That's great. Let's go then. Okay, thank you, Inês, for your introduction. As she mentioned, it's been 20 years now I've been working with education in digital culture, actually almost 22. Yeah, 22 years. And I've always worked with this focus on how digital culture transforms our modes of learning and teaching, and how our lives are related to what society is going through in terms of changes. The digital world changes. The social culture we have is quite different from the social culture of 20 years ago, and I'm going to talk about the impact this has in environments. When we have learning environments as a theme, we usually think about online environments alone. but there are various in person, online environments, and often merging both, which we have seen an acceleration during the pandemic. Even with all of the issues involving access here in Brazil, Elizabeth, we have very little access in schools so far, very little availability of resources, connection wise. This is still quite a challenge, as Inês mentioned. Access is over the phone, and we do know that the phone is part of our lives now. If we don't have the charger somewhere, then you're out of battery. Everybody has felt this way. We truly depend on phones, this integration that us humans are having with these tiny machines nowadays in our lives. In this conversation here with you, I'm going to talk about some of the problems of education which persist. Well, they already existed before the pandemic, but they have persisted and became more evident, and they persist as challenges. And taking the chance that Elizabeth was mentioning challenges. How did that start? We had the problem with access and connectivity. We have a direct association between technology and innovation. When we talk about innovation in education, people automatically associate to a certain technology device or platform of technology, as if innovation was only related to the use of technology or not. And this is not how it goes, as Elizabeth mentioned with her example of promises and if changes happen or not when we integrate and bring technology to our daily lives in the classroom and projects. There are so many inequalities. In a sense, you're talking about access to high quality education and inequality to the type of connection. Our students are still, the vast majority, access the internet through prepaid data plans. And when these are over, you know what happens? You can only access social media. These are commercial platforms of small, a few companies. So we do not have internet that is actually free for everybody. Teacher training, this was quite a challenge 20 years ago. It still is because teacher training cannot focus only in the application of a technology, the use of a resource, but it's actually a professional development. The professor or the educator, I go to my practice, I'm going to evolve throughout the years and learn from my own projects, right? I learn from my students. And I become connected with the new generations and trends that are arising in society, which is quite a challenge we face. Many times we learn how to do things one way, but then a bunch of things change and we are not connected to these changes. I mean, our doing with these changes going on around the world. Training public managers, connecting to what Elizabeth meant, policies. Yes, when we're talking about those, these are not for getting votes, but this is institutional, educational policies. Our managers, pedagogical, administrative, or legal managers, because we do forget that in a Secretariat of Education, you have managers of different profiles. And it's quite rare to hear a conversation or a dialogue because often the pedagogical side wants one thing, the administrative should approve, but they don't understand what the pedagogical wants. They want to push something else that is not what he wants. The legal department doesn't understand why that platform should be used. It got to get approval and so on. It's collective work for training. Our own educational managers face huge problems, such as funding. We don't even have to mention how complicated the times have been, cutting things for education in the country, basic education and universities. It's quite sad what we're going through. This point for me is crucial when we're talking about this moment in digital culture we're in. instrumental understanding of technology. We're still saying technology is a tool. The technology is only an instrument, as if it's neutral and it's not neutral, and as if technology, if it's not a vast field of knowledge that us in humanity sort of saying, we need to understand this, such as the IT guys should understand the issues that we are working on, that we are raising awareness on, like social, ethical, gender issues, how technology reproduces stereotypes and prejudices that are traditional in society. That's why I've mentioned Professor Paulo Blickstein here, because in a recent event at Book São Paulo, the web curriculum, I don't know if you heard about it. He said it's about time education talks about if we should use technology. We should start to talk about how to use technology for real. So I added these two questions. I don't know if it's only about how, but which which technology do you want to use? Which one? Which one are we going to choose? What's the criteria for technology use and what for? What's the purpose? What are we going to do as we choose this given technology? This timeline helps us understand a little more about the change. I don't even know that you who are at the university, if you are more aware of these changes that are more recent, like less than 10 years, the datafication, platformization, because this comes from developing those technologies involving AI that are now data-based. Why are we talking about data so much? Because it has to do with the development of these technologies. Everybody's heard that the internet came from DARPANET and all of that story about security issues in North America, to have your documents without needing a physical space that's concentrated in interconnecting information. And in the end of the 1980s, we had the web, which is the one we're still using. I have Tim Berners-Lee, like a symbol there. But it's important to remember that with him, there was a huge group of researchers working for 10 years straight to be able to have the web available for us as it's now. And as a public asset, a common good for humanity, which is what we're still hoping for, but unfortunately, things are not moving in this direction, and we'll soon understand why. Later in the year 2000, social media, social networks came, Web 2.0. Well, we cannot talk about Web 2.0 nowadays precisely because of the platformization. This is a book which is symbolic of Joseph Van Dyke and these two co-authors who wrote the book The Platform Society with her, which is not available in Brazil yet, but there are Brazilian researchers talking about the book. So maybe I can give you the references later. We're still looking at Web 2.0 as something that's a tool. Like, because right now in the year 2000, it was very interesting to have social media or networks. And it came with this optimism to democratize communication, the promise, as Elizabeth mentioned. They were born from the promise of democratizing. We'll no longer be only consumers of information, knowledge and culture. We'll be producers. And this was all very nice until these large commercial platforms and large companies started dominating the scenario of the social medias. And this happened in the phenomenon that we're going through now, which is platformization. So we do no longer have the Web 2.0, and this was only a dream from Tim O'Reilly 20 years ago. Sometimes we forget that we're in the year 2022. 20 years ago. Sorry, let me just grab some water here. You see how we're still looking at Web 2.0? Actually, in BNCC, the standards for education in Brazil, which is still the policy, is still disconnected from the moment we're living through right now. I created this graph just for you to understand because I don't know how much you know about AI, artificial intelligence. It's important because this technology gives basis for the platforms for this phenomenon of datafication to occur. When the web started, we were talking about education through technologies. One of the main catchphrases was learning to program. And you're doing like, wow, that's a new literacy. Everybody should learn how to program. But AI nowadays, data-based, it changes completely the idea of traditional programming. Not that it doesn't still occur, it does. But more and more technologies are based on this AI technology. In traditional programming, we would write the code for the program, and the machine or program will run the commands just like you programmed it. This is why it's called coding. In AI, it doesn't happen this way. It's actually a probability statistical model receiving data, which will be used in a model that's created, and this model will create correlations between data. This is why people who are studying the technology, they write this virtuous cycle. The more data I have, the better my product will be. The better my product is, this will generate more users, generating more data. Therefore, I'm going to improve and perfect this technology permanently. But this issue is good for technology developers because it generates profit, bringing more people, more consumers to use your products. Now, what should we be thinking? Whether in education, especially public, we can generate data to contribute with something that's commercial. Is this really what we want? Or what is our reflection, at least, about this? I don't think we are reflecting upon it. I mean, we've seen in the pandemic how many platforms were used by the state and municipal networks as well as universities just because it was convenient. It was free, but there is no free lunch. Free means you're paying with data because that's hidden. We don't see. It seems free, but it's not free because data is the most important asset in data economy nowadays. That's why it's so important for us to discuss what and which platform do you want to use. So, about metadata that Elizabeth mentioned a little bit, because we usually think data is what we are inserting, like name, numbers, and the data that we usually put. But there are several metadata connecting what is beyond, what goes beyond data. Metadata, we don't perceive they're being collected. These are some of them for you to have an idea, but there are several. And on the phone, since the apps are interconnected by default, in the model, you have to find a way to go there, set up the phone system and disconnect this because this is all interconnected. Data are permanently circulating. Not only what we type, but our behavior as well. Voice, have you heard about? I was talking about something and suddenly I saw an ad. That's right. Phones, the new phones, especially the new ones, they are more and more advanced in this technique of data collection. What is the problem? Well, there are many, and we're not talking about these in education just yet. An evident problem that Elizabeth mentioned very well has to do with data, and the use these data have in our students, our schools. How are these data being used? What for? Another problem is understanding this oligopoly, just a few companies dominating all the platforms. And what does platformization mean? No longer Web 2. And this graph shows this well. What we are producing when we comment and post, that's all in the proprietary commercial platform. It's no longer that freedom. We, as we post, as we comment, as we like, we are generating data. And this will only make these very few platforms richer and more profitable. That's why it's not freedom. We are today surrounded by it. And it's not just studies that we're doing, it has to do with our mobility, relationships, our shopping. We do this all through platforms, and we should be talking about it. We should. Public management should be thinking as a policy. We working with students, we should talk about it, and we're not. We're only talking about think well before you post, which is not enough. We should think, well, where am I going to post? How does our information get processed? Facebook owns, WhatsApp, Messenger, Instagram, a single company now called Meta. It dominates all of the social medias we're using. Look, the purple ones are from China. These are investing a lot too in these technologies involving AI. And I recommend you, I don't know if you've seen a documentary on Netflix, AlphaGo. This documentary shows a champion of the Go game that was defeated by AI, which is much more powerful than the AI who won the chess game in the 1980s. Have you heard about it? Kasparov. This Go game AI that was actually purchased by Google. These startups they develop and then the big ones buy them. This tournament with this AlphaGo was the impulsor of all the investment China started doing in AI. This was in the year 2012. For you to see how recent this all is. But that's a change which is really ongoing and in a way that is quite devastating in our lives. You can also watch documentaries talking about these issues, about addiction, how addicted we are to social media, also the use, political use, a scandal, Cambridge Analytica. So it's important to know that these things are taking place and they are quite recent. And the more you have created, well, there is drama going on in the documentaries, but it's worth it because it impulses our conversation. And what I like the most is coded bias, talking about the bias that the face of the black researcher in MIT, I think, is it? I don't know. When she was just putting the white mask on, and this is how she was recognized by the machine which generated all these problems. And in terms of advocacy in the country, it was very nice. This documentary is very nice. It's very much worth watching. And the bubble phenomenon, which is the one we know the more about, we learn about bubbles. Bubbles are bubbles with people who we're usually talking to, looking at posts, because we don't know how our feeds get organized. My search on Google will be different than in a search. We can look at the same, but Inês will get different results than me because the algorithm is based on our data and is going to show the result according to our own search profile or navigation. This problem with the pandemic that I brought specifically for Elizabeth, because I wanted to know if this is happening in the USA as well, Elizabeth. Our education networks are using advertising. No, they're actually advertising for companies, advertising for the platforms. And what's worse, they are delegating what should be the purpose of the universities, partners, and networks which we're doing professional development. So what they're doing is delegating these ads for training. What do? These companies hire other companies, intermediaries in Brazil, to offer training, which generates fidelization, which means when I train someone, I'm training the person to do only one thing. I don't want them to expand mentally and learn about the importance of having options and choice. No, I will create dependence. And this is what the secretariats are doing, in my understanding. I think it's lack of knowledge, really, and the public managers don't know any better. As I mentioned in the beginning, pedagogical, technical, legal managers, they all think everything is very free and very nice, and they're delegating what is their job as an education network, which is promoting teacher training. We are doing this work in Brazil called observatory surveillance or education. It has to do with open education, which is from the UNESCO chair at the University of Brasilia that I'm part of. I'm from Educa Digital, which is an education that it's been going on for 12 years. And we're talking about the Initiative for Open Education, which is now a research group. This initiative has several projects similar to this one about surveillance in education, which is educaçãovigiada.org.br, where the researchers who are here with us at the university, the Federal University of Pará, created a script, and the script monitors where the server of the email of each and every university and Secretariat of Education is hosted in. And we verified that 70% of our public education hosts their email addresses outside of Brazil in the so-called cloud, especially Google's and Microsoft's. But you know that the cloud is a metaphor. There is no cloud, you know. You know what a cloud is. Has anyone ever thought about what the cloud really is? You guys at the university might be following these discussions, but we often think that the cloud is in the air. Where is our file? Where is our data? The cloud means machines that are gigantic, called data centers, machine centers. And these companies I've shown you changing the scenery, they have different data centers all around the world, usually outside of Brazil, with their own legislation in these places. The Internet Forum taking place this week in Natal. One of the tables is to discuss international data transfer, which is another very current theme. We are actually sending our data like it's a colonization, it's a neo digital colonization. There are authors talking about this. I can share with you the references later. Another thing that the teachers are impressed when I'm giving them this information is when we talk about the submarine cables. Didn't you guys know that the physical internet, the cables, taking our data to these data centers that are submarine, they are enormous. Have a look at the submarine cables websites. You will see the map of the submarine cables around the world. Almost 95% of them are submarine. Only 5% of the internet is satellite. And nobody talks about infrastructure when we're thinking of environments and the internet and what the internet means for education. So this is a reflection for you. So to finish what I'm saying and for us to talk about it, I would like to talk about these two concepts that are so mentioned in education: digital literacy and digital citizenship. Digital literacy is still confused with digital fluency, like you should learn and dominate a tool or app, especially those the big companies one. But digital literacy is more than this, involves understanding the political and social context involved with these technologies and who these platforms and technologies serve. When to use or recommend the platform, what company are we recommending? Who owns it? What are they doing? That's good. Are they polluting the environment? But the data centers, these are one of the biggest polluters in the world in terms of CO2, as well as extracting minerals. We don't connect the environmental problems with technology, but this is really plenty of. But we don't think about it. We don't go deeper in anything. Another thing about digital literacy, this is work I've been doing in the initiative for open education. How do we share knowledge in a way that's open? How do you use open licenses for copyright? How do you use commons? How can I share using open materials, looking for open technologies? It also involves creativity, inventiveness. If I'm creative, or if I think I'm being creative of having the students there working with, I don't know, a platform or a service that is owned by Microsoft or Google or another one, is this being creative? How can I encourage creativity? Am I creative when I'm looking for open data in my city? And after this, I'm going to try to solve a problem for the community. How can I still be creative with the digital world, which is incredible? But if we are using less and less because of the platformization phenomenon and literacy, this has to do with a collectivity, and I'm talking about assertive technological choices. I like to emphasize as a collectivity is important. We should not think that individuals will be making choices. If we are in an education network at the university and the collective decision to be taken, and choosing the technologies should involve different questions and points to reflect. Digital citizenship, because actually literacy and digital citizenship should be a single thing, but we should separate that we don't usually see this happening in unison, which would be idea. What is common and well-being and knowledge and the well-being of citizenship, human rights, how are they taking place in the digital world, involving digital rights, for instance, access to information, data privacy and protection, freedom of expression. How do these human rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, how are these taking place in the digital environment? This involves learning about regulatory framework in the country, especially. We do have the civil internet framework from 2014, and when people in education, they know what this means in terms of internet. Not only Article 26 that missions is to teach about digital citizenship, but the civil framework as a whole is very symbolic because it talks about governance in the internet, and in Brazil it's multi-sectoral. Internet is not ruled by the government alone or a company, is multi-sectoral. There is a company, government, academia, universities, and as well as the third sector. This is why I'm talking about the event I was in Natal yesterday. It's the CGI, the committee that manages internet in Brazil. This was all created by the civil framework for the internet. Now we have the general law for data protection, bringing a very specific article on protection of children and teenagers, Article 14, that we need to know about and understand what this really means, and talking about this with our students so it doesn't become a mere clause in a contract that unfortunately does happen. And understanding also what the individual and collectivity means, what is part of us understanding, what is responsible, safe use for our navigation as well as collectivity. There is no separation, like I'm going to do things properly and I won't care about collectivity or the community. This should not happen because it has the participation of the citizen, how to use the internet to take a chance to participate in civic processes in my region and country. This is why open education is important as a historical movement promoting equity, inclusion, and quality in education through open pedagogical practices that are based on the freedom to use, combine, change, and redistribute educational resources, incorporating technologies and formats that are open, prioritizing free software, and defending digital rights. In this sense, open education goes very well with public education because it's not looking for profits. We cannot associate public education with profit and commerce. Open education is part of a recommendation from UNESCO from 2019 calling all of its member states to create practices and policies to promote educational resources that are open. This is a referatory because we are not storing resources, but we map the resources available through open licenses, and you can research there the type of media, the field of knowledge, and you're going to find different comments there because we use this referatory to our training. So the educators, they're going through the activities and they go there and they use the resources and they leave comments on what they thought, what they recommend, which is really nice because it's not curatorship but mapping really. We're trying to organize better and facilitate the search for educational resources that are open for educators. Another environment that is one of our projects that I recommend is the free choice. It focuses on open technologies. So you're going there and you're getting to know open technologies for collaborative research, web conferencing. There will be resources on how to produce audio, like a school radio, and other open resources that are not using our data as a business model to generate profits. These are usually done by communities, which are interchangeable. Well, they are exchanging knowledge between themselves. I don't know if you know about Moodle. Moodle is an online course environment that's really well known, and we use Moodle, and it's getting more and more incredible. Several plugins coming because the community actively develops it. And it's worth getting to know it. Many times the decision is not ours. The institution imposes to us what to use. But even so, it's important to know, to present to our students that the internet is not only about platforms. We cannot let the internet be a synonym of large companies and platforms. There is also Pillars of the Future, which we launched last year during the pandemic. It is an open platform, open code. The idea is to encourage educators to share good practices in digital citizenship. By understanding digital citizenship based on the four UNESCO pillars that are related to social and emotional, like this focus on emotional aspects that Elizabeth mentioned, that is so popular now in education. Social and emotional comes from these four pillars from the end of the 1990s, I think 1996. Education is a treasure to find, learning to learn, learning to do, putting our knowledge into practice, learning to live as society, which is still the major challenge for us as society, not only in Brazil, but all over the world, and learning how to be. I mean, we understand our projects for our lives. It's always important to mention, you guys, let's not talk about my project. We change. There are different stages in our lives. It's important to get to know yourself and therefore learning along the way. So I would like to invite you to get to know the project. We have brought very updated practices like this one I mentioned. I mean, did you know there is no such thing as a cloud? How can we work on this issue in the classroom? Another one. Can the algorithm propagate racism? Is there a timeline that a Brazilian creator has created? Yes, there are several situations the algorithm has clearly have proven to be generating more discrimination in society. So we're creating these practices and people who have practices of digital citizenship can just go register with your name and email address, and we have the curators, the teachers we invite, and we are starting this new platform, and I invite everyone to join and collaborate. I also invite you to look at the guide we launched last year together with the Alana Institute that has very strong work on consumption, advertisements in childhood. This also has to do with Intervoices, a journalistic collective of freedom of expression, especially in education. So we're using this guide for parents and educators to better explain this problematic involved with data protection of children and teenagers and the use of technologies. So as we choose technologies, let's understand why the privacy in data is so important. Now this course here, the virtual school platform at Bradesco Foundation, I took this one based on research that I just finished. It's about AI in education and also complex thinking. It's a little bit of what I've been telling you. What is this new context of digital culture? Why should we understand the AI advancements in society nowadays? That's a game. It's about open education policies. You can download. It's also available in English, English, English and Spanish. And it's a game, a board game that encourages conversation to diagnose for policy. So we're looking at the network of education, a secretariat. We sit down with the people from all departments, pedagogical, technical, and legal, to understand how open our policy for education really is and what we can do to promote more opening in this policy. I invite you all to play the game, and you can assemble the game, and you can print it down, and it's a puzzle. So we also study the use of terms in privacy policies in the platform that has educational services like Google Education, Microsoft Education, and we found different issues present in the terms of use and privacy policies that we never read because they were made for no one to read them. But with the data protection law, they must change. They have improved. We're going to update the manual soon. In this report, on literacy and digital inclusion in the contemporary situation of Brazil, I wrote last year for a workshop at Unicamp, where I'm doing my PhD in languages and technologies, together with the Bristol University. It was an online workshop, and this report is already available both in Portuguese and English. See, Liz, so it's about the situation of contemporary Brazil when it comes to these aspects. I think I should stop now. I think I was a little over time. I forgot to ask Inês to tell me about time. Yeah, let me come back. Oh,
Priscila,
Priscilla,
não
I
tive
could
coragem de
not stop you
cortar,
because I
porque
think
eu
these
acho que são
are
questões muito
very
instigantes.
intriguing
Acho
issues.
que a
I
gente
mean,
teve
we've
aqui
had this
nessa
afternoon
tarde
so
até
far,
agora
and
e
we're
vamos
still going to
continuar ainda com as
continue
questões que
with the
estão surgindo
questions
aí
that
no
are
chat.
appearing on the
É um
chat.
diálogo muito
This
profundo que
dialogue has
traz
been
questões assim,
very
muito centrais,
important about
relativas
central
tanto às
aspects involving
oportunidades que a
opportunities the
internet
internet has to offer
oferece e o
and the
processo de
learning process
aprendizado
with
numa
a
visão mais
broader
ampliada desse
understanding
aprendizado que
of
a
learning as
Elizabeth
Elizabeth has
trouxe aqui, o
brought, learning
aprendizado em todo
everywhere,
lugar, um aprendizado
learning
centrado na figura
centered
do
on the
aluno, né?
student.
E aí eu me lembro, não
And
tenho como
it's
falar,
impossible
ouvir essa
not to
frase da
remember what
Elizabeth,
Elizabeth
não
said,
conectar com Paulo Freire,
not
que é um
connecting
dos
with
maiores
Paulo
educadores, é o
Freire, like
patrono da
the
educação
patron of education in
brasileira,
Brazil,
e que toda
that
a
all the
concepção de educação do
understanding
Paulo
of
Freire
education
é
that Paulo
fundada
Freire
na ideia
created
de que o
is
aluno
based on
sabe e
what
a
the
gente
student
precisa
knows,
conhecer o que
and that
ele
we should
sabe
know
para
what the
dialogar com
student knows
ele
to
e
build a dialogue
fortalecer esse
and
caminho,
strengthen
né,
the
de
path
uma
towards
autonomia,
autonomy
né, de uma
and
autodeterminação
self-determination
no
on the process
processo de
of
descoberta do
discovering
mundo, de
and
leitura do
understanding
mundo,
the world.
não é?
And
Então,
at the
ao mesmo
same
tempo que
time,
a gente entende
we
essa
understand this
ampliação, essa
amplification and
diversidade,
diversity.
é muito
It's quite
desafiador o
challenging
cenário
to
que a gente se
be in
encontra
this
quando a
scenario
gente
as we
observa
see
o
how
quão permeado
permeated
pela
by the
lógica
commercial
comercial
logic the
aprendizado
learning
dos
of our
nossos
students have
estudantes
become,
estão.
and
E o
how
quão
difficult it is. I mean, if it's
se é
difficult
difícil
for
para os
adults,
adultos, né?
can you
Então,
imagine how we create, how we develop this culture of data protection, and how we develop this digital literacy project, understanding that in the market context, we're talking about power hierarchies, which are so unequal, like brutally unequal. And while I have companies, entire companies, organized based on a commercial model, using data to improve their services, including in education as well, being in the schools during the pandemic that we have seen so strongly in Brazil. I know it was not only here, but in different places too. You have a whole neocolonization process, as you mentioned. And this process of colonization is being re-inaugurated through technology because what is being signed as consent terms, if it's hard enough for an adult to understand all of those rules, when we tell about them to children and teenagers, this is almost a fantasy because in practice it doesn't happen. In many situations, even when you are signing, there's also an indication that the rules might change in the country of origin and will be impacted by it, and you will either sign it or not use it, not have access to it. So, including, I want to share something with Elizabeth. In Brazil, the state has been violating rights in terms of data, the level and the way the Brazilian country has collected data on the level of institutions, education, health. People have no security whatsoever about this data. So we don't have an understanding that is collective about this demand. People and isolated groups, like we're talking about here in different experiences. And Priscilla brought different experiences that were very rich. But these experiences of digital literacy, they're always very localized, not reaching the dimension of such a large country with millions of users doing the same. So it's quite interesting. And I would also like to take the chance to ask a question that appeared here, and you can ask other questions. But a question that was brought here by André Sarli. He's in Geneva. He's asking a question about the paths for us to deal with these platforms that are indeed commercial, but they're occupying many spaces, almost a role of a public service provider. So, how can I bring the dimension of the public interest to this discussion about the platformization? How can I bring the public interest to the conversation? I mean, we're talking about how interesting it is to think about the dimensions of regulation, right? It's always a theme that's quite controversial online when you're talking about regulation. Because ever since its creation, the internet has always been conceived as a space for freedom. But it's curious enough, especially to the trajectory that you have narrated, it has become quite the opposite of it, becoming a space to spread fake news with impacts for health and democracy and impacts in public life of all the people. And this is not going through the approval of society. I don't even mean the state, but society. Companies are managing the content that comes to us or not. So we're usually discussing these aspects often. Like we have this dimension and clarity of what we post, but we don't know where this is going, if it's going to have the repercussion we want, and the investment we made to this kind of diffusion, because that content is more interesting than another one that is going to be controversial and generate all of the debate or engagement because it's sensationalism, entertaining. So it reproduces patterns that are not new. They've existed in communication for its entire history. So I would like to hear from you about these dimensions of platforms and also the public interest. How does it go for media literacy in schools? What is the reach we have in this type of training in schools with teachers and communities? And if there are other spaces that we can intervene for building this utopia or rebuilding this utopia for having an internet that's inclusive, plural, because we have not forgotten about our dream. We're still here. We're using technology to build the debate. Yeah. So the dream lives on, the utopia continues, and I would like to hear a little more about it from you. We have made such a complex and rich diagnosis of this reality. So, since we don't have much time, let's talk about future ways, future paths to follow. You can start, Elizabeth, and then Priscilla. And while that, I will look at other questions here. We are not running out of time, but let's try to see what we can do.
I'll be brief so that I can leave time for Priscilla as well. I think one of the strategies that Priscilla mentioned that I would like to just amplify is was when she was describing her work with open educational resources and with using tools like Moodle. There are alternatives. There are alternatives out there that exist, and those alternatives are often better aligned with societal values. And for example, the Priscilla describing your work and how it's very much grown out of the communities that then would use the curriculum, that presumably is going to be approaches like that are going to have a much more natural fit to the specific environments. And I think thinking at the scale of our communities, I think there's real legislative issues, but I think in thinking at the scale of our communities and thinking about our own social systems and how those come with values that we want to support in educational systems and for ourselves is probably a great approach. But it needs not only like the grassroots piece, but it also needs things like school support for making those kinds of choices, time for teachers to think about how to use them and to find the materials. So it's not something that you can just, that teachers can do, communities can do, but also municipalities need to support those initiatives. And I know, Priscilla, you also talked about some legislative issues that I think are very important. But I'll stop there.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Let me take the chance. There is a question for Priscilla to answer since we're really running out of time. I would like to ask, so in the end we can finish. It's a question for Priscilla. With Web 3.0, is this scenario of edification, vigilance, surveillance can be modified? What are the impacts of Web 3.0 in digital literacy? So this is a question from Georgia to you. No, not Georgia. José. José Magnaldo.
Tá bom, Inês, vou tentar também
Okay, I'm
falar.
trying
São
to
muitos
do this. There
assuntos.
are many topics.
Reforço o que
I'd like
a
to
Elizabeth
reinforce what
colocou. Eu
Elizabeth
acho que
said
um
that
caminho, sim,
one of
desses
the
vários
paths would be
recursos
involving open
abertos,
educational
até
resources,
porque
especially because education,
educação,
especially
especialmente
public
educação
education,
pública, não
does not
combina
go
com
well with
comércio, não
trade
combina
nor
com
profit.
lucro. A gente precisa
We
que os
need
nossos
our educational
gestores
managers to
educacionais
understand this
entendam
new
que é um
scenario
cenário
of
da
platformization,
platformização,
of
da edificação,
dedication.
e só eles
And
entendendo
if
isso,
they
eles vão conseguir
understand, they will
entender os
understand
usos
the commercial
comerciais.
uses.
Em
In 2019,
2019,
there
teve
was
o
a
lançamento
launch
dos
of the
princípios de Abidjan.
Abidjan
Não sei se
principles.
vocês já
Have you
ouviram
heard
falar.
about it?
Vocês
You can
podem
go look at
procurar
the
princípios de
Abidjan
Abidjan, tá?
principles.
Tem até a
There is
versão
a
em português.
Portuguese version.
Foi
It
lançado por
was launched by
várias
different
entidades de
entities in
vários
different
países,
countries,
mas quem
but
tomou
those
a
were
liderança
the
foi o Conselho de
leaders,
Direitos
were
Humanos
the
da ONU.
members
E
of the
esses
Human
princípios,
Rights
eles
Council at the
falam
UN, and these principles
veementemente
are
contra a
vehemently against
mercantilização da educação.
mercantilizing
Por
education.
isso que os nossos
So our
gestores
managers
precisam ser
should
formados.
be
E quando
trained.
eu falo
And when I'm talking
gestor, eu
about
falo do
managers, I mean
servidor
the public
público,
servers,
porque eu
because I really
acredito
do
muito
believe
que os
that the work
trabalhos
of
de quem
everyone
está
there
lá
in
nas
the networks
redes, que quem
Those that are part of secretariats and ministries, they are the public servers. And even though there are new managers coming, the more they can be trained and understand this new scenario, the easier it will be. No, not easier. Easy is not ideal. The more opportunities we'll have to have policies that are more according to public education as it's said in the Constitution. That's a human right. This is one of the main issues, training these public managers. As educators, we should go find out more about open educational resources and understanding that right now there is a project for a law to regulate platforms that are being very much debated, 2630, which is very much worth getting to know about. The people at the Internet Forum and the coalition of different entities in Brazil that I participate is a coalition for network rights. That's a gathering of different civil society organizations working with advocacy in all of these issues that are related to digital rights. And the SPL has positive and negative points, and it's a discussion that us in education should be approximating these discussions and reflections. And I think the first and most important thing of all would be to stop thinking or saying that technology is a tool. Technology is a field of knowledge. AI is a field of knowledge. And we should understand how it's made, how it happens, dialoguing with people from different fields of knowledge. Universities should be more present in their training sessions for basic education, which is the only way out. Trying to maintain and fight more and more for education to be indeed a human right, to remain as a human right. About, oh, I forgot who asked the question. André. Okay, André. Web, no, Jose. He asked about Web 3.0. No, this was Jose. Jose, sorry. Great question, Jose. I was going to mention this during my presentation about metadata, but I forgot. I would like to talk about the history of the metaverse that we are listening about Web3. But this Web3, we don't know what this is. It's a little bit of blockchain. It's a little bit of NTF. As an example, people creating a meme or a work of art, which becomes an asset that's highly valued if you buy it, is the so-called NTF. We don't know what this means for Web3s, but we cannot confuse it with Web 3.0, Tim Berners-Lee dream. After the Web 2.0, we would have the semantic web that would understand us. This was appropriated, that has become appropriated by datification. So people think it's the same. Well, this is a simple text. Professor Diogo from PUC São Paulo, he differentiates this. It's very nice. Metaverse. It's the same, you guys. We are in it. I don't know if you know, the metaverse is not a thing that is going to happen. It's not the 3D environment everybody believes it to be. Metaverse is the fusion of digital and in person, which became intensified during the pandemic. Ever since we started using emails, we are in the metaverse. You know why? Because we have another space for relationship and communication between people, which is not only physical. And people start using the metaverse as if it's the biggest innovation in the planet, as it's usually with technology for education, right? Everything is wow, such a surprise. But when people tell you about metaverse, think about this. It's a fusion of in person and online, and we're in it ever since only emails before social media. We were there. These are experiences, our bodies. If we can communicate, whether in person or online, this becomes our daily lives. So it's not just that I'm having 3.0 as the metaverse.
Agora a gente
Let's
entendeu.
understand that Web
Temos
3
Web
is
3 ou Web
something we
4.0,
don't
ainda não
know its
sabe definir,
definition. It's still happening.
acontecendo,
And
e a
Web
Web
3.0,
3.0, no que
unfortunately, it
vem,
seems
parece
that
que não
it
vai
won't
se
ever be.
concretizar.
It
Era um
was a dream
sonho do Tim
of
Berners-Lee
Tim
na
Berners-Lee, the
Web
semantic
semente.
web then. Thank you,
Priscila,
Priscilla.
obrigada.
Yes,
Alguém
someone
colocou
put here
Web 3.0
non-fungible
É,
token. Okay, then
eu vou
let me
aproveitar o
take
seu
the
gancho
opportunity to mention
aí
the
do
metaverse
metaverso
and
para
tell you
dizer que o
that our
próximo
next
evento
event
da
in the
nossa
series
série
will be
vai ser
about the
sobre o
metaverse.
metaverso,
It
tá?
will
Vai ser
be
no
on
dia
July
7 de junho,
7th.
Ah, olha
tá?
We're
A gente
going
vai
to
trabalhar a
be
questão
talking
da
about
ética no
ethics on
metaverso,
metaverse.
tá?
And I would like
E eu queria, a gente já está
to say that we
no
have run out
horário
of time and
esgotado,
I would like
né?
to
Eu queria
respect
respeitar assim, o
people's
tempo das
times. So
pessoas.
I
Queria
really,
agradecer
really
muito a
thank
Liz, a
Liz and
Priscila,
Priscilla for
por terem
having shared
compartilhado
with us,
conosco, por
for
terem
having
trazido
brought
provocações
these
assim que vão
provocations that will
reverberar nas
reverberate
nossas
in our
reflexões aí,
reflections
na
next
sequência,
and in our
nas nossas
actions and in
ações,
our
nos nossos
studies and
estudos, nas nossas
research for sure.
pesquisas.
I
Queria
also want to
agradecer
thank
também a
all of
toda a
the
equipe do
team of
LabGRIM, da
LabGRIM,
Ubíqua,
Ubíqua,
que
giving
tem
us
nos dado
support. A
apoio. Um
special
agradecimento
thank you to
especial à
Lorena for the
Lorena pela
translation.
tradução, né?
And
E
also,
queria,
I would like
gente,
to
dedicar
dedicate the
essa
webinar we
webinar que a
had
gente teve
today
hoje
to
para uma
an
educadora
extraordinary educator,
extraordinária,
a
uma
really
grande
big
lutadora
fighter
cearense,
from Ceará
que
who
nos deixou
passed
essa semana.
last week.
E eu queria
And I would like to read
ler
a
trechinho
small
de um
part of a
texto que o
text that
sobrinho dela, que é
her
jornalista,
nephew, a
fez.
journalist, wrote.
Ela
She
foi
was
uma
so
resistência
resistant
na
during the
ditadura,
dictatorship period.
foi uma mulher que
She
lutou no
fought in
Ceará e
Ceará
no
in
Brasil
Brazil.
pela
She fought
democracia.
for
E eu
democracy, and
dedico
I
a ela em
dedicated to her
especial pelo
especially
fato
because
dela
she
ser
was a teacher.
professora
And
e
also
pelo
the
fato
fact
também
that
de
she
que ela
was
foi
a
uma
teacherless
professora, Liz,
who
que
was
levava
taking
os
her
seus
students
estudantes
to
a
learn
aprender com
with
ela
her
no
around
mundo,
the world in
nas
the
lutas
social
sociais, nos
struggles,
movimentos
political movements,
políticos, nessa
this
concepção
broader
mais ampla
concept of
de,
really
de fato,
engaging
engajar as
people,
pessoas em
something that
algo que
makes
faça
sense for
sentido para
them,
elas,
the
a luta e a
struggle and
utopia
utopia
por um
for a
mundo mais
world that's
justo.
more fair.
Então
I won't
não
read
vou
the
ler
full
o texto todo, eu vou ler só
text,
dois
just two
trechinhos como
parts. It's a
homenagem a Rosa
tribute to
Fonseca.
Rosa Fonseca.
Rosa
Rosa
Fonseca é
Fonseca is
flor
a
de
flower
mandacaru,
of the
que
Mandacaru
resiste à
cactus,
sequidão das
resisting to the dryness of
injustiças,
injustice,
das
indignity,
indignidades, dos
the
flagelos,
poverty, but
mas
she
que
flowers
floresce
in the
das
waters of
águas das
the
lutas,
fights,
dos projetos,
projects, and
das
the
causas
most
mais
urgent and
urgentes e
necessary causes.
necessárias.
Rosa,
Rosa
she
emancipa
emancipates subjects,
sujeitos, liberta a
freeing
história.
history. Rosa,
Rosa
the teacher.
professora,
Rosa, the
Rosa
master. A
mestra,
master of
mestra das
factories,
fábricas,
of
das
villages,
vilas e favelas,
and slums
das
and communities.
comunidades.
Rosa,
Rosa
the
é
radical.
radical, Rosa é
Rosa, the
mulher,
woman.
Rosa
Rosa,
é
the bird,
passarinho
who's
que
now
canta
singing
livre
freely and
e voa
flying
por
when
onde
there are
não há
no ways to
caminhos.
follow. And by
Com
saying
isso, eu
this, I
fecho
would
o
like to
nosso
end our
webinar
webinar and
em minha
paying my tribute
homenagem a
to
Rosa, que
Rosa,
além de tudo
which
é
is above all
uma
someone I
pessoa que eu
lived with
convivi
for many
muito,
years, and
por
I've
quem eu sempre
always
tive
have been very
profundo respeito.
respectful for.
Então,
So
muito
thank you
obrigada a
all
todos
who
e
have
todas,
participated,
a
all of
toda a
the
nossa
audience who
audiência que
came,
esteve
all of
aqui,
the
a toda a
collaboration
colaboração de
and the
vocês,
participation
participação de
of
vocês aí no
everyone in the
chat,
chat
por
with comments,
comentários, né?
everyone for
Todos que
attending.
vieram.
Thank you.
A gente
We're
fica
really
muito
happy,
feliz e
and we
espera
hope
que
these
esses
dialogue
processos de diálogo
processes lead
nos
us
levem mais
further
longe, que
so
a
we
gente
can
possa
also
voar
fly
para uma
towards an
internet
internet that's
mais
more free, more
livre, mais
secure,
segura,
and more
equânime, né?
equal and plural.
E
This
plural.
is
É
what
isso que
we're
a
looking
gente
for. This
deseja,
is
é
why
por isso
we're
que a gente
here.
está aqui.
Thank you,
Muito
everybody,
obrigada a
for
todos.
participating.
Obrigada, obrigada Inês, obrigada a todos.
Muito
Thank you so
obrigada.
much.
Obrigada, gente.